Thank you very much, Dean Rutherford, for that very kind invitation. I am very happy to be in Arkansas. This is the first time I'm visiting this state, and I said to myself, before I leave the United States and end my term as an ambassador, I must visit Arkansas. To me, it is one of the states which represents a big part of the United States. That's what I've been told. You know, there are different corners, and Arkansas is certainly one of them. And of course, you know, Donna and Mac are such great friends. This is a wonderful couple. They're wonderful Arkansans. And in Washington, D.C., ambassadors soon learn that the term mover and shaker is very American, but I use it now. And they really make things happen. And they are wonderful, gracious people who express the hospitality of Arkansas. Of course, Arkansas has wonderful people. Senator Fulbright, William Fulbright, and you are represented by the Clintons, President Bill Clinton, who reached out to Asia, and now Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, whom we all acknowledge, even in the short time, is doing a very good job. I can answer questions on that. But today, I have given myself the title in my talk, After the Financial Crisis, Asia and the New World Order. And I thought that there would be enough interest here on that topic. I would like to speak about the financial crisis and how Asia fits into the larger picture. As a Singapore ambassador to the United States, what is immediately obvious to me is that we are all in this together. Now, I know Arkansas is doing much better than the other states, weathering this crisis reasonably well, but nonetheless, it is not a good time. Singapore, like many other countries, has been hard hit by the crisis. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, expects that the Singapore economy, which was a rising star and we reported 8, 9, 10% growth on an average, will contract as much as by 10%, minus 10 this year, is the worst in our history. That's IMF. We think it's minus 6 to 9 ourselves. Now, this should come as no surprise because Singapore is the most globalized economy in the world. External trade is 3.5 times our GDP. So when the global economy is suffering, Singapore's economy does badly. The wealth of Singapore and larger Asia has been built from globalization. In the almost 3 decades of the 1980s, 90s, and until 2008, Asian economies from China to India, including ASEAN, which is the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, excluding Japan, was a region of dynamic growth and robust economic activity. Japan went through a lost decade, but from early 2002 onwards, it began to recover its position coming out of a long stagflation. They cleaned up their bad debts in 2005. With the emergence of China and India, East Asia became more integrated in international trade investment and people linkages. Greater economic linkages were pursued through what we call free trade agreements, and there have been free trade agreements signed in Asia between different countries and economies. A great sense of self-confidence grew in Asia. When the financial crisis hit the United States, there was a sense that perhaps Asia could be insulated from the problems of the United States. We know now the banking and financial crisis spread, affecting Europe first, but reaching Asia as well. We have never seen anything like this. Asia has been through a financial crisis before in 1997. We also went through an IT bubble burst. Then we had something called the SARS crisis, not H1N1, but SARS crisis. Now it's H1N1 as well. Then suddenly, frighteningly, the key engines of growth shut down globally. Now, some countries will weather the storm better than others. Some will stumble, but pick themselves up and grow stronger. It's crisis, collapse, reform, growth. In fact, the current financial crisis, this global crisis, is likely to shake things up globally. There will be winners and there will be losers, and the pecking order of global and regional powers will surely be affected. Now, there are two questions I want to discuss with you today. One, will the Asian economies recover? How will Asia do? Will the slowing down of globalization impact upon our growth? Because Asia's growth was built on globalization. Second question, what will the new world order look like after the financial crisis? First question, will the Asian economies recover? Now, the financial and economic crisis quickly debunked the myth that Asia was decoupled from the developments of the United States and the European Union. While Asia has been dynamic and robust in its activities, we have largely been a single platform in the globalized process of production, with the end product made largely for the US market. Some goods did go to Europe. With the plunging banking crisis, the seizing up of credit and demand, trade shrank, exports dried up. At the start of this year, major Asian exporting economies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Singapore saw their exports shrinking by between 30 to 40% month on month. Suddenly, your exports go down, minus 30, minus 40. When Asian trade ministers meet, I am told, they joke about those who has joined the 30% club. That is, those who have seen their exports plunge month on month by 30% in the first quarter. Now, this has scaled back the growth rates of the economies from previous years. As you know, we were talking of the Asian miracle, high growth, and so on. This has scaled back the growth rate. Even China, whose growth was unstoppable, is expected to grow by only 6.5%. Now, that's bad for China. They've been growing at 10%, 11%. And if you ask the Chinese government, any official, they will tell you China needs to see an 8% growth rate every year simply to meet the job demands and to satisfy just the new population entering into the job market. So 6.5 is hardship for them. India, which has been pulling 7 to 8% in the last 3 years, will probably do about 5%, a little more than 5% growth. So that's a bit of a slowdown too. Asia realizes that unless the US economy recovers, there will be no real recovery in the region. The minister mentor of Singapore, the man who built Singapore, some of you may have heard of him, Lee Kuan Yew, said very recently and very precisely, when we see a 1% growth rate in the US economy, we will see recovery in the Singapore economy. So we're waiting for the United States to get a 1% growth rate. Let me say up front now that there are challenges to recovery. With the contagion of the crisis, there are many countries that are opting for protectionist policies and moving towards a degree of isolation, or import substitution. The British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said there was some, quote, unquote, deglobalization taking place. The new protectionism comes in the form of creeping protectionist measures. We're not talking of a Smoot-Hawley Act, but every country has, in fact, introduced little measures which are protectionist. Few of them, you add them up, is creeping protectionism. The World Bank cited 73 instances of protectionisms since G20 met in Washington last year. You remember there was this big meeting of the G20 countries, and they all the leaders said they will restrain and try to, stop protectionism. After that, 17 of the 20 G20 countries introduced protectionist measures, and if you count measures, G20 and non-G20, you can document 73 measures. In the United States, the Buy America provision appeared in the US stimulus bill. President Barack Obama put a caveat there to say, Buy America within WTO, constraints, that you've got to meet those regulations. In Europe, some countries are designating that bailout money should only go to national companies. China very recently has come out with Buy China, a requirement for spending also with the stimulus package, perhaps a retaliation against the Buy America. Now, these are not good signs. What we need to watch out for are creeping measures, government interventions, and investment nationalism. The stalling of the completion of the Doha round is also a sign of deglobalization. Yet, trade, ironically, is the way out of any economic crisis. No matter what immediate populist measures governments may take, they know the importance of trade, and globalization is here to stay, and that trade will start the engines of growth. Unless we disprove David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, there is no question that trade is a win-win agreement between trading partners that can bring greater prosperity. In fact, trade has been integral to wealth creation in this country. According to USTR statistics, freer trade has helped raise America's GDP by nearly 40% in the last 10 years, with over 16 million jobs added in that period. The Department of Commerce figures support such a conclusion. Manufactured exports support more than 1 in 6 manufacturing jobs. Your exports create 1 in 6 of the manufacturing jobs. And 30% of the US economy depends on trade. In fact, the United States is the largest trading nation in the world. Now, Singapore and the United States signed a free trade agreement, and it was started under President Bill Clinton in the year 2000. We completed it under the Bush administration. But this free trade agreement is an excellent case study of the benefits of trade for the United States. In 2008, the United States enjoyed a widened surplus of $12.9 billion from this bilateral free trade relationship. We're one of the few countries where you have a surplus with. We have a deficit. You have a $12.9 billion surplus in our two-way trade. But, we feel it's fine because our surplus comes from elsewhere. So you give some, you take some. Singapore is doing our part to continue this conversation on free trade because we are APEC chairman for 2009. I recall that even when the profound Asian financial crisis happened in 1997, and Asian countries suffered mightily then, no Asian country turned its back on globalization or argued for an inward-looking approach. We set forward reforming our banks and economies. And I think those who in 1997 in the financial crisis reformed furthest came out the best after the crisis. So while there has been some slowing down of globalization during these difficult few years, and we can expect this to be, I believe there is no more efficient alternative to rapid wealth creation than trade between nations. Countries are seeking new markets and new linkages, even as old markets are shrinking. We see this happening now. You know, we've lost one market, you go for another market. So globalization is here to stay. Asia will recover from this unprecedented global crisis. We have been through this before. The problem for many countries is not for us in Asia. It's not a financial crisis, but a crisis in the real economy. Trade has collapsed, and with it, economic growth. But in 1997, it was different. There was Europe and there was the US that was doing well, engines to pull us out in 1997, out of our crisis. This time, there are no such engines. Many in Asia, and I think elsewhere in the world, look to China as the engine. And Chinese leaders, in fact, have said, China can save itself. Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, said, China can save itself, but China cannot save the world. And I think there's some truth there. So, you know, he's lowering our expectations. Fortunately, there are some mitigating factors. Many Asian governments like Singapore have exercised fiscal prudence over the years. We have saved for a rainy day. Singapore has reserves. These countries can use their reserves to inject liquidity into the economic system. Right now, we have put out a stimulus package, which is 5% of our GDP, to jumpstart things. My government spending is focused on infrastructure and a job credit system to help our workers keep their job and to equip them with training. I was just telling Dean Rutherford just now that the government of Singapore is offering every employer who keeps a worker to pay up to 12% of that worker's salary, up to $1,200. So if you keep your worker, the government will pay 12% of his salary. Maximum is $1,200. It's an incentive to help employers keep the workers. We also have another scheme which is credit. The government of Singapore will guarantee a project up to 80% with the bank so that the private person, the entrepreneur, can go ahead to borrow money from the bank to help credit going. So this is what we do with the stimulus package. And we hope for a couple of years, if we do things, things will jumpstart. So we are doing things of this sort. China also has a stimulus package, and their stimulus package, which was in the region of $596 billion, should help Southeast Asia, because when they spend, they'll buy some from the region. Japan has also announced a couple of stimulus packages, and Prime Minister Taro Aso in March said Japan will put forward $1.3 trillion in economic surplus, in an economic stimulus package. How that works out, I'm not quite clear. I think he said it in response to Secretary Tim Geithner's call to all the G20 countries to put out stimulus packages. Some countries agreed to do that. Not every country agreed. Some of the Europeans felt they didn't need to put out extra stimulus packages. But in Asia, the governments are all putting out stimulus packages. The Asian countries will work through this crisis, as we have others before. The Northeast Asian countries, Korea, Japan, China, are strong economies. Japan and China are among the three largest economies in the world. South Korea was the 11th largest economy. India will slow down, but will work the problems out too. They are not that open yet, but they will try to be. And the Australian economy is doing very well. They were doing well before the global crisis. They stumbled, but they are picking up again. And ASEAN, my region of Southeast Asia, is a diverse grouping of countries. Some will do better than others. On the whole, the Asian countries would have invested in education. We have good habits. We have competitive levels of skills, which is why India and China continue to be destinations of outsourcing. And given these factors, I think we will be able to respond to the financial crisis and come out of this. The New World Order, that's the next point. What then is the impact of the financial and economic crisis on the reshaping of the world order? Looking at East Asia, one cannot fail to notice that a global rebalancing of power is taking place. The recent crisis will quicken the reordering. The American hegemonic moment was a short one after the Cold War. But the United States remains the preeminent power globally, given its leadership in the military, economic, and political sectors. But other powers have emerged as serious players: the European Union, China, Russia, India, and Brazil, leading to a much more multipolar world today. But they are not equal poles, even if it is a multipolar world. It will be asymmetrical multipolarity, with the United States still the leading power. In fact, my foreign minister, Giorgio, said, the United States will remain the preeminent pole for a long time. And he went on to say, without the United States in the lead, multipolarity can be unstable and even dangerous. Without the United States driving the G20 process, the reform of global institutions cannot be accomplished. Some have raised the question whether it will now be a G2 world, G2, with the United States and China dominating the issues. You hear this a lot in Washington. Clearly, the United States and China relationship will be the most important relationship in the coming decade. Many issues will need the cooperation of these two countries to succeed. The United States has recognized this, but we do not see a formal G2 institution being formed. I don't think China will want this. China wants two, but not the G. They don't want G, G2. They're afraid of institutionalization. I think it's the responsibility. What do you expect, you see? G2 will work together on specific issues of global importance. I think China and the United States, and we can see all this coming. Now, what I predict is that you will see a proliferation of the Gs. I call this the geology or the geometry of the structure of world power today. G8, G13, G18, G20, any number of Gs. I am sure you'll find more Gs coming on. There's also BRIC, B-R-I-C, BRIC, a grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, a term formed, tossed out by somebody from Goldman Sachs, a man called Joe O'Neill, I think. So there's BRIC, and Brazil, Russia, India, China. These countries are big economies, emerging economies, and they've been meeting. Their foreign ministers are meeting, and recently they had the first BRIC summit in Russia, in a place called Yekaterinburg. on June 17. BRICS' main concern, these four main countries, their main concern is to seek a larger role commensurate with the size of their economies in international affairs, but they don't know quite how. BRIC has called for a more diversified monetary system, and they pledge to work to reform the international financial system. China and Russia have advocated an alternative reserve currency. After all, but I think that will not come for a long time. All this talk of reserve currency. You may have heard that the Chinese central banker has suggested that maybe we look at the SDR, special drawing rights at the IMF as an alternative currency. But I think it will not happen for a long time. China has $2 trillion of its reserves in the US greenback. They are not going to do anything that's going to affect the value of that reserve. So they do not want to destabilize or devalue their assets in the process. But nonetheless, it is interesting to know that in Washington Post of June 24th, there was an article written which raised for discussion the possibility of the end of the dominance of the US dollar. It cited Fred Bernstein, a noted economist who said, quote, "Like it or not, the dollar is going to lose some of its global status," unquote. But I believe for some time to come, most of the global community will see the US dollar as the currency of last resort and the reserve currency of the world. They're not going to change that much, but the basket of currencies may, the weight may change a little bit. And you have the yen there, you have the Deutschmark there, is there. And the Chinese yuan has not yet come on. And for a while, the Chinese were very concerned about internationalizing their currency. Recently, they've started denominating some of their trade in yuan. The Chinese renminbi or yuan is the same thing, So there's a bit of that. But I think it's not going to replace the US currency. It's not even going to move that far up. But it's interesting that people are thinking now about this. Now, apart from symmetry, there is clearly something emerging as well, the G's different group. I would say it is the use of soft power by players other than the United States and Europe. For a long time, it was the United States that had hard power, soft power. The French feel they have soft power, French things. Europe and British soft power through the English language has been very, very powerful. It's their claim to great power status. We're all speaking English, and there's great influence. British education, British marmalade, whatever. But it is now getting more competitive in the field. In Asia, Chinese soft power is evident in its highly successful regional diplomacy. This is something new. They used to be quite ham-handed, coming in very hard. And in the 70s and even the 80s, countries were a bit wary. In the 19th and in this decade, the Chinese have practiced an excellent diplomacy in the region through soft power, through the use of aid, assistance, trade, markets, and investments, and their style of diplomacy. They have won many friends and expanded their influence. And China is now active in Latin America and Africa as well. India is another country that will potentially have this power. Yes, because it is a great civilization and it has that. But I don't think India has entered into the game that much yet. But Indian industry and entrepreneurship and Indian business is already making its mark on the world. They have not yet opened their markets as much. In fact, the Chinese have opened their markets much more. The Chinese market is much more open than the Japanese market. and most American business people will say that who do business in Asia. I'm coming to an end, but recently an article in the Financial Times on the rankings of the top 50 financial institutions and banks in the world surprised many readers. It was interesting to note that in 1999, there were 24 US banks in the list of top 50 banks in the world. The top 4 were 2 US banks and 2 UK banks. This is 1999. 24 of a list of 50 are American banks, and the top 2 banks are American, the next 2 banks are British. There were 6 Japanese banks and 1 Hong Kong bank. 10 years later, in the year 2009, US banks in the list fell to 11. Top 50 banks in the world, 11 now are American. The top 3 banks in the world are Chinese banks. The 4th was JP Morgan Chase. 6 Chinese banks plus 1 Hong Kong bank made the list. The strength of the Chinese banks was notable. But it does mean something, but I think whether they will hold that position is something to watch. The US economy is huge. It is a $14 trillion economy before the meltdown. Even after the meltdown, I think it will still be the largest economy in the world. And once economic recovery takes place, things will move. For the Chinese economy, you're talking of a $4 trillion economy, so there's a big gap between the two. Once economic recovery takes place, I think things will move. Recapitalization of the banks could take place. It is also the mark-to-market accounting, I think, that is driving down the numbers for US banks. I would not count the US out at all, which is why I think it will be an asymmetrical, multipolar world in the future. But there is no doubt China is the winner in this crisis. Asia, with China, Japan, and India in Asia, will become a serious player in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Now we're going to have time for a few questions. And Mr. Burra.
I enjoyed hearing you today talk about how the change is going about. We've had even U.S. experts come to this school and talk about that China will supplant the United States as the #1 economic power at some point. They don't know when, but it will, and they predict within 50 years. How will the rise of China, eventually becoming probably the #1 economic power, change the global thinking in relationship to different philosophies of Eastern thinking versus Western? Western, the domination of the world has occurred for a prolonged period of time, and this shift to East Asia will mark a dramatic difference in global thinking when that happens. And I want you to talk about how that difference in thinking will influence the globe. And one other common aspect, how do y'all really think of North Korea?
Oh, very good questions, thank you. Yes, I think many people project that the Chinese economy will become the largest economy in the world. You can put any date, all this is in the future, so you can say 2030, 2050. Mind you, whilst it is the largest economy in the world, because it's 1.2 billion people, you know, you're talking of per capita that will still be much lower than the United States. It's the largest economy, but not the richest economy in the world. And the United States will progress. You know, it's not as if China is going to grow and the United States does not grow. In Asia, some of the Asian countries, we still see the United States having leadership in creative and in innovative things, science, technology, in your military power. The Chinese economy will grow. But China is a big country, there are very poor regions, and the Chinese keep saying, we have to bring growth into the interior, and they will do that. But a China that is living at the level of, say, South Korea, over the whole of China, is enormous. Is enormous for every country because the needs are there, they will buy, they will be investing, and that's when you will see your markets, the trade moving. Right now, India has the largest middle class in the world. China will have the largest middle class. What will happen? Will we see things differently? There will be more models in the world, different models. There will be and interestingly, even new models will be based a little on the American free market model. The Chinese believe in free market. They haven't dumped the free market in the crisis. They want the free market to work because a free market export, oriented economy will in fact be the reason for China's growth. Now, they've got to jiggle that a bit, tweak it, not so much dependent on export. You must do some, import stuff, internal development. But nobody is rejecting the basic American model of free market growth and trade. So that will be there. You just vary it a little. So there will be the Chinese model. People talk of the Korean model, the dragons, the Singapore model. What's the difference? Is the belief in free market, but is the nature of government, whether government will be more centralized or more decentralized. Even in China, there are now different centers, challenges. People seek more autonomy, more freedoms. So, it will be nuancing. It's nuancing. And so I would say, yes, there are different ways of doing things. I remember the Washington consensus of deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. And we all tried that, and we had the financial crisis as a result. Now we won't rush to deregulate so quickly. You deregulate, but maybe there'll be a balance between some areas where you keep watch and control a little. So I see variants of a model. Asian countries like to believe that there's a way of keeping authentic Asian values and culture. If you're Japanese, you are Japanese. They're still very Japanese. Japan is not America, although in many ways they run a modern economy. And China will be China even when it runs a major economy. I think it's the attitudes and values. If I had to sort of put my finger on something, I would say it's the degree of centralization. Although now you are having the state play a bigger role, but in Asian countries, the state plays quite a big role in even free market economies, a bit like France. I hope that answers your question. And Asian countries will look to different centers for inspiration. America will still be there. Education is still very much now with focused on the United States. But I think students will be going to China too. So there will be different centers. Thank you.
What about the question on North Korea?
Oh, North Korea. Yes. There is a UNSC Resolution 1874. I think I've long thought North Korea wants to be a nuclear weapons power. It's their last card. They played the same card all the time, as people in Washington say, it's a bit dog-eared, but they're still playing it, But there's no other alternative they have. They're blackmailing their way out, and they're sort of trying to get things. But I think now they are at the UN, we've agreed to take certain actions. But what do you do about North Korea right now? They're going through a succession crisis, and they're totally unpredictable. But right now, they are more unpredictable than ever before because I think there's a succession. So we're doing what we can. We're trying to monitor. If ships come into the high seas, and our way, countries have agreed that they would try to make sure that there will be no proliferation, that they're going to try to, do what they can under that resolution to show North Korea they are being monitored and tracked, and they cannot just sell, materials which are WMD materials. But you have to get them to talk. I would say, they are used to, President Bush used to say, they're like a kid throwing a tantrum. When they throw a tantrum, you have to sort of come to them. I think right now, the approach seems to be pause. They shoot off, do a couple of tests, let's see what's happening. Sit there, don't react immediately to give them something. And the Obama administration seems to want to make them a bit more accountable. So let us see, It's a tough one.
Okay, questions? We have one right here at the back, Clinton School student right there. Ryan?
Thank you for pointing me out. Hi, thank you so much for being here, first and foremost. One of my main areas of concern is the area of human rights, and it really goes along with the first question. And for me, I see how you talked about how the contraction of nation states working more towards themselves, going away from a globalization mode. And I was just curious, with your experiences in life, if you felt as we move forward into this new world order and shifting of powers, how that would affect the advances made in human rights regarding women's issues and gendered issues, and whether that opens the door for more rights or actually restricts.
I believe that economic development is liberalizing. When a country is industrialized and developed, it ushers in liberalizing forces. The way you organize your life and what you do. Women in Singapore, they work, they can do anything. Most of them, in fact, want a career so much they're not getting married and they don't want to have babies. It's a big problem for my country, But, you cannot keep people down. You cannot, once they are educated. And I think in Asia, you will find that countries like, China, for instance, if you ask a Chinese citizen today, in 2009, what his rights are compared to 1978, which is before modernization, he would tell you he's living in a totally different world, So the rights do come. Maybe not as fast as what Western countries want to see now, immediately, But there are new areas, a lot of social freedoms. You can travel everywhere. The internet has introduced a lot of freedoms, and governments have been challenged how to handle, this new liberalizing force, democratizing force, and they get new power with the internet. So I think that development will be good, and this shift in of the gravity of the world, I don't think that will stop human beings gaining human rights, more and more human rights as the country becomes more developed. So we should encourage growth in the countries. The citizen will not sit down and take it, And so it's, I think you will see change.
All right, Ms. Abrams, right here. Let me give you this microphone.
My question is, if the 21st century technology is going to be the tool for the new world order, what impact is it going to have upon the educational systems of America in a global world when it's had an isolationist educational system?
I hope it's not too isolationist. I know for a while it was hard for students to get visas into the country, but that's easing out. The United States has done very well in attracting the top brains from every country, and you were able to keep some of that brains. Now, because there are other centers of growth, some of these brains return home, which is good because that's why you educate them, so they can go back and develop their countries. But there's no doubt you have the United States is a magnet for the talent pool. The education of the lower levels and the delivery of education to the median group in the United States is not as good as education at the top. Some countries in Asia do better, delivering education to the median group, and so not so good at the top, so we come to the United States and other Western countries for education for the top. I think the president now, President Obama, seems to want to tackle that issue. So we will see. For a while, it was thought, you've got the lead in the field. Can you keep that lead? And unless your education keeps up in science and math and technology, you will not do that except by imported talent. So once the United States decides to change something, I feel it changes very fast and it has great impact because you put money, resources behind it. But you will have the technology still. I think Singapore's belief that the United States will keep the lead is based on the fact that we think you're very creative, you're very innovative, and your technology, you will never let your technology slip. And the invention of things will still see the bulk here. Other countries will come up with some things, and they will try to copy, but the invention will be here. And you will maintain that, because at the top, the United States is very good at bringing people right at the top. You find the visas and so on. It's a young man who's coming at the age of 18 to go to college that finds it very hard to get a visa to come in, but that is changing.
Okay, Charlie, right here.
Just on relationships between Singapore and the United States, trade relationships,
Yes.
if you could get one thing changed, what would it be?
Be careful what you wish for, they say. We have a great relationship. I think right now, if I can get one thing changed, I would like to see the United States focus much more on trade and maintain your trade relationship, which you've had in the past. I know it's hard during this period, but it is very important. We work very well, the United States and Singapore, on defense, on business, economics. We're out there in the Gulf of Aden with our asset, doing the piracy, we're in the waters there, keep doing our share, and we're doing PRT in Afghanistan. We've been helping, giving assets on Iraq in the past. And Singapore offers its facilities to American military forces. When you were asked to leave the Philippines, Singapore offered entry to the American military, but we are very small. You can put the whole of Singapore into Subic Air Base, in Clark Air Base, So we said, come to Singapore, use us, have a toehold, and you do that. And we get about 100 ship visits, defense vessels come, your submarines come, your aircraft carriers come. So we have a very good relationship there. What we can work on really is to have the United States give good attention to Asia. I think President Barack Obama and Secretary Clinton has started by focusing on Asia. I hope they don't get distracted as things go on and you turn back to the Middle East and Afghanistan and Pakistan and so on. But you've begun focusing on Asia, and we would like to see the trade issue addressed.
We have a question right here. Yes.
I'm asking this question for somewhat of a personal reason.
Yeah.
My daughter works for the IMC group there in Singapore, and I'm wondering how is a private enterprise such as the IMC group, I'm sure you're familiar with the IMC group, Pan-Asian Alliance in Singapore. how is it impacted by the economic downturn?
All our private companies have seen, have felt that, the exports have dropped. Services have dropped also. Singapore is a great service center as well, financial services, professional services, and we manufacture things. What we manufacture is at the high end. It is petrochemical manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, biotech stuff, wafer fab, electronics. Now we're into environmental technology, water technology, But apart from manufacturing base, we also do services in the region, financial services, professional services. And that has seen a drop. But the drop in professional service is less than the drop in manufacturing and the trade. So we're sort of managing and hoping that it will last just 2 years. As I mentioned earlier, the government of Singapore has offered some schemes where companies can draw on the funds to keep the company afloat. And we hope to ride it over 2 years. If you go to Singapore, people are quite calm still about the financial crisis. I think this is because my government has good credibility. People believe in the word of the government, which I'm told is not common. And my prime minister and the finance minister and so on have made it very clear. They've come out and said, this financial crisis will last 2 years, we think. And when the US economy starts moving sometime next year, that's when we will start moving. Now, if you tell the Singaporean, well, it'll be 2 years, they say, okay, it's going to be difficult for 2 years. Click in their heads. And because the last 4 years have been good, they've saved. They're digging into their savings. There was a poll made of Singaporeans, and they said that the middle class thought they could stand 8.5 months without work and be all right, because they can live on their savings. So they will draw on that. But once you tell people, well, it's going to be a 2-year thing, people make their calculations. Of course, we'll start panicking next year if the end is, the end of the recession is not in sight. For the moment, there is some calm. Yes.
Sorry, we're going to have to cut this off, but
there's one hand.
All right, then we'll take one more
from that side.
Oh, thank you, Mrs. Ambassador, for your talk. Singapore has been a very strong economic and political system for a long time. And I was wondering if, since it's a Chinese-based system and in Asia and knows Asia so well, that if what your thoughts are on future Chinese political system and economic system, and if Singapore is a model for that.
Singapore is 75% Chinese, 15% Malay, who are all Muslims, 8% Indians, they came from India, forebears, and the rest we have a mixture, Jewish, Parsi, American, whatever, different people. The Chinese have been coming to look at Singapore. They can't understand why every time we have elections every 5 years, relative is fair, free and fair. The same party has been re-elected all the time. And so they would like to see how that is done. I think Singapore's secret is that the governing party is non-corrupt. That's the one thing we try to maintain. No corruption. And all these transparency indexes list Singapore amongst the top 3 or 4 countries, together with the Scandinavians and New Zealand. We seem to do very well. Notice, we're all very small countries, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, New Zealand. It's much easier to be transparent when you are small. You know who's who, who's what, and who's taking what, So we are non-corrupt. And ruling, the governing party performs. So if you're non-corrupt and you perform, you know, and they can, sometimes they win by 60%, sometimes 70% is very good. They never get beyond 70%. But usually it's between the high 50s and 70s because they lose votes. And there are some opposition members in parliament, not many. Will the Chinese become like us? The Chinese will be more open and they will become more democratic with a small d. But you will not see an Anglo-American democracy. I think you will see a dominant party. They could become, one way they could go is a bit like Taiwan initially. You know, the Communist Party becomes like KMT. For years, KMT dominates. And who knows, further down the road, it changes. But in China, I think the Communist Party is, I don't know what the ideology is now because I'm not sure it's communism. But they would certainly like to have the party still there. So right now, they're trying different kinds of elections at the lower levels. There's election and choice within the party, but, you know, it's the same party. So I think you will find some changes there. It will not be Anglo-American. They may have, some scholars, Chinese scholars, have speculated that you will have elections at the village level, even provincial level, but never at the top level, not for a long time. So, you know, there are different ways of managing. It'll be a quasi-democracy.